So it's not always the biggest moral decision that we will make, or the most permanent moral decision in the face of the earth. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a moral component. It simply means that it's not the ultimate moral decision making that we're going to go. We live between what Bonhoeffer calls the penultimate and the ultimate being the kingdom of God, and the realization of Christ's return, and all things being returned to what they were intended to be. The penultimate is where we are now. It's the last thing before the ultimate. And the penultimate, we have to remember that only God has an ultimate claim on our life. Nothing else supersedes that claim on our life as Christians. And so God's judgment and God's justice and our relationship to God are what frame everything else. It doesn't mean that we can't think about it in other ways. It just means that our touchstone always has to be, how does this comport with what my faith and or I know to be true in understanding justice or understanding any other social issue. The challenge, of course, is while we live in this penultimate world, all those penultimate things will seek to grab our loyalty, to become our religion, to become something to which we are more loyal than we are to God. And that's a real challenge for Christians everywhere, because it's so easy to be captivated completely by the cultural or philosophical movements that we're interested in, and so become more loyal to those things than we are to God. And so that's an issue that Bonhoeffer highlights over and over again in his writing. It's not one we usually talk about, because we're usually trying to get Bonhoeffer to say what we want Bonhoeffer to say. But what happens to us when we get deeply invested in those political and cultural things is that we end up living like functional atheists. Okay, so we live as though God doesn't exist. We live as though everything in the whole world depends upon the choices and the decisions we make and the conversations we have. It's not to say that nothing doesn't depend on those things, but it is to say that it's very easy for us to become functionally atheists in the way that we live our lives and the way we think about the things that we're doing. So part of what we're about in this whole series is not denying issues. It's not about saying that we don't have appropriate responses we need to make. What it is about is that we need to actually understand where our ultimate loyalties lie, and to then avoid the trap of living as though God does not exist, or thinking that God does not exist. For example, we live in a country, and I've said this before in sermons and elsewhere, we live in a country that is conceivably maybe the most powerful country in the world right now. That does not mean that it will be forever. And all you have to do is read the Old Testament to find out that those things change. Nebuchadnezzar never thought that his empire would collapse. So it helps us to maintain perspective, and it doesn't mean that the things that happen here now in 2020 are the most important things that have ever happened in world history or will ever happen in world history. And I think that when we get sucked into that, then we lose sight of the fact that ultimately our conviction is that God is ultimate and and nothing else rises to that level. That God ultimately will bring history. The Christian gospel says, among other things, that God will bring history to the conclusion God desires for it. That may not be our desire, but it will be what God desires for it to become. So, you have anything else you want to add on any of that?
No. Does anyone questions or comments on that in that regard?
Okay.
Okay.
It's all yours.
Okay. So as we turn to the question of what a Christian understanding of justice is, what we would like for us all to kind of bear in mind is that when we think theologically about these matters, we can think about them critically, and we need to learn how to think together about them critically. That's an effort that we all need to be willing to actually make. I think generally speaking, not just in the church, but across the culture, we have real difficulty actually being willing to have those conversations. We tend to be afraid of them. And as a result, when it comes to theological issues, we have the tendency to say, well, you have your ideas and I have my ideas, and I can't critique or criticize your ideas, and you can't critique or criticize my ideas. And I think that comes from confusing two different things. And I'm going to use these words more narrowly than we typically do on a day-to-day basis. But I think we really ought to distinguish between them. And that's distinguishing between being critical and being judgmental. In popular context, we tend to use those words interchangeably, and I understand why we do that. And there's no denying that those words have acquired some similar connotations. In other words, if someone said to you in a difference of opinion, well, you're being critical. You, in some contexts, wouldn't be saying much differently from saying you're being judgmental in the minds of either person using that language. The difficulty is that the way that we shift between those two words in popular parlance, we also obscure a really important difference. Thinking critically about an idea does not need to be, or when it is being done properly, thinking critically is not actually about saying anything about the person who holds those ideas. In other words, what we think and who we are two different things, and there's a certain sense in which we ought to hold on to that distinction. That's the only way that we can learn. That's the only way that we can talk with one another. That's actually the only way that we can grow together. And especially in the church, where we hold that we are all members of the body of Christ, to fail to hold on to that difference and to realize that what we think or know at any one time is different from who we are is a really important distinction if we're going to grow as members of the body of Christ. And in an effort to think critically, there are three questions that we can always ask. Probably others, but I think that these are among the central ones. One question is where do your ideas come from? Where do our ideas come from? And from a theological point of view, if we're going to think about something like social justice in Christian categories, we need to think through those issues. Um, are the does the way when we talk about thinking about Christian understandings of social justice, are we drawing on scripture? Are we drawing on the traditions of the church? Um, are we drawing on things we've learned from the larger culture? Are we drawing maybe on impressions and assumptions that have taken shape as a result of our experience? Knowing where our ideas come from to some extent can help us to evaluate them. If you want a fancy word for it that I give to my students, because $25 words always are really popular in graduate school, it's an etiological question. etiological, as in the etiology of a word. What's the root of a particular word? I don't want to suggest that in asking that question, that identifying where an idea comes from necessarily is a vote up or down for the idea. I may have said this in the past, but one of the things that stuck with me even since my undergraduate days is the observation that one of my professors made, that all truth is God's truth. So wherever the truth is that we learn, there's potential truth to be found in it. But at the same time, those truths sometimes tell you something about their fundamental content and so forth. So, for example, to use what I think is a fairly obvious example, if we're thinking critically and Christianly about the whole notion of resurrection, okay, in Christian theology, which has to do with the conquest of death, then assumptions about death that say, well, death is just natural, or that death is not somehow contradiction to what we believe as Christians, coming maybe out of our culture or coming out of other religious contexts. You can't really combine those ideas easily. To say that death is natural is a very different thing to say that death is conquered in Jesus Christ. And the origin of those two ideas may tell you something about it. It's part of the reason that you can't be a good Buddhist and a good Christian. You can learn things from Buddhism, but Buddhism holds that our lives are lives of detachment until we detach and release from life itself. A second question that we can ask is the question, do our ideas hang together? And again, if you want a fancy word for that, it's a question of coherence. I think it's popular for people to assume that thinking theologically is about finding a grab bag of nice devotional ideas. And that you just kind of make assertions about God or about life, and if it helps you, it's a valuable idea. The problem is that we're all helped by ideas that aren't necessarily coherent at all from a Christian point of view. So someone dies and you try to comfort them and you draw on things you've heard in the past, maybe even in your own church context, and you say, well, it's a blessing in disguise. That idea might be comforting, but it doesn't hang together very well with other things that we know about God or other things that we know about death. And so whenever we think about something like the subject of social justice from a Christian point of view, one of the things we're going to ask is, you know, how much do the ideas that we pick up about justice from the culture or from our own personal experience or from our politics or other things, how closely do they cohere with Christian assumptions about social justice? I find myself telling my students a lot these days that, in fact, one of the things that you have to do whenever you try to engage work for justice in public context, you've got to realize that some of what non-Christians assume about the nature of justice is very different from what Christians assume about social justice. And then finally, the other critical question that we can ask is, where will our ideas take us? Where does a particular idea lead us? And again, another fancy word for it is teleological, T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-Y, teleology, from the Greek word telos, meaning goal or end. One of the ways we can test our ideas about social justice and about whatever Christian understanding that we have of it is to answer the question, where would that idea take us? You know, where would it lead us? What would it result in? So, for example, when we talk about social justice and we use terms like equity, what kind of equity are we talking about? And can that kind, if equity is a part of social justice, what kind of equity can we hope to achieve? What kind of equity is impossible to achieve? And so we can test our ideas in that regard. Those kinds of questions, where do our ideas come from? How do they hang together? Where will they take us? As applied to a theology of social justice, is very different from being judgmental. Being judgmental is saying, I don't care what your ideas are, I just don't like you. I don't care what your ideas are, I know what you believe, and you're just wrong. Your intentions in terms of holding a particular idea are evil. Or to use the words of the Queen of Hearts, sentence first, verdict later. It's about bypassing the facts and about pronouncing up and down on an idea, on a person, rather than evaluating ideas. And what we're really inviting you into in the context of this conversation is really a charitable, critical grappling with the ideas that we have about this. And our hope is that whatever else we might set in place will have helped one another think rather more critically and charitably about Christian understandings of this subject as an aid to navigating the larger public conversation. Thoughts, questions, things that I might not have been clear enough about? Jack?
Yes. An example, say, we don't have to dwell upon it, but just so that I'm kind of clear about what you're talking about. What example of Christian um, uh, social justice, how we might view a particular issue versus one not biblically based or secular. You know, because they come from different perspectives, and if we don't keep the God in front of us, then we end up, you know, being functional atheists, right? So
Right.
well, just so that I give me a launching point. What is an example?
Okay. Good question. And I'll try this one, Jack. Uh, though I'm pretty sure it's not a simple one. As we get into this subject, I think that one of the things that we would argue is, and I don't want to get too deeply into this because we're going to come back to it. So this is just an illustration.
Right. Just yeah.
Right. I think that one of the things that shapes Christian understandings of social justice is the notion that humankind is made in the image of God. That one of the things that shapes and should shape our relationships is the notion that we've been made in God's image, and everyone around us, all human beings, regardless of creed, color, race, personal biography,
Intellectual ability,
value to society, level of intellectual achievement or creativity. None of that's as relevant to shaping Christian understandings of social justice as is being made in the image of God. In the larger culture, and this is kind of an interesting example in this way, in the larger culture, there are people who would never use that language because they don't believe in God, or because the notion of being made in the image of God is not a part of their own religious orientation, or because something else is more important in terms of their sort of point of view. So the concept in the culture globally that's taken hold more often than anything else when we talk about social justice in global terms is human rights. Now, interestingly enough, the whole contemporary conversation of human rights is actually grounded in the Judeo-Christian conversation about being made in the image of God. But what has happened over time is that the theological sort of origins of that have, and I mean understandably in a way, been stripped away in an effort to try to get language that a larger group of people would be willing to assent to. And so when we talk about the origin of that idea, it's one of those things where, well, the origins of the notion of human rights are Christian, but it's been recontextualized to kind of strip out and drop the Judeo-Christian associations with it. And you begin to evaluate it in those terms. And one of the things that you might say is, as a Christian, is you might say, well, wow, I mean, yeah, I believe in human rights, but I believe that human rights are really only important as to the extent that they're grounded in the image of God or in us, and knowing that this is God's will for us, transcends and cuts across a lot of problems that might be, considered, or a lot of problems that may arise out of talking just about human rights. I mean, for example, it's really hard to sell the Chinese on the idea that the Uyghurs, the Muslims who are now being kept in what are effectively concentration camps, they call them re-education camps, it's really hard to convince them that they are deserving of human rights. And of course, we've made our own mistakes on those grounds in this country, whether you talk about slavery or you talk about the internment camps during World War II of Japanese Americans, or the medical experimentations with the African American pilots during World War II, or were experimented on without their knowledge or permission. So one of the problems with talking just about human rights from a theological point of view is you can argue for human rights, but of course, if people don't grant you your human rights, you can be denied them either on an ad hoc basis or in a systematic fashion.
This is one of those places where we believe Christianity has a much stronger foundation from which we can work than some of what's offered culturally. Human rights conversations presume that all cultures regard each human life the same way that a culture that grew up out of a Christian understanding that there was something of divine worth in every human being regards them. And that's simply not the case. And so we make assumptions about how other people are going to act in a cultural or non-religious context, because we've sort of denied that human rights and Christianity have very much to do with each other in the culture. We've stripped all of that away, and we make this assumption that everybody thinks the same way that we do about things, and that's simply not true. Take a look at what happened in Rwanda, 15 years ago? That was a tribal war, and it was a tribal war among people who did not believe the other people were of any value. We have such a hard time comprehending that we can't see it. But it is the way that much of the world operates. It's not, in India, for example, while they have passed lots of laws to make jobs available to the Dalit, the untouchables, the caste system in India still functions. And it still functions in some very hard and brutal ways. And if you are of a lower caste, you are not worth as much as someone who is among one of the many castes of Brahmins or upper class people. And they're upper class by virtue of birth, not wealth or anything else. But you're not worth as much. Your life is eminently sacrificable, to invent a word, under those circumstances. And so we need to be aware that and part of working out of a Christian context is that it makes it clearer to us. We need to be aware that the whole world does not share our assumptions about who's worth what. And the whole world does not share our assumption that there's something inherently worthy about any human being.
And it's also a way that we hold ourselves accountable as a church too. Because I think that one of the places where we've given ourselves to grave sins, and yet one of the things that is held the church accountable across the centuries has been this notion that our behavior toward one another is grounded in our conviction that there is a transcendent God who by nature has certain expectations of us, and that we can't escape that. We can't escape it by pointing to our culture. We can't escape that by making utilitarian arguments and saying, well, I think this works better than that. We can't, it keeps our prejudices open to criticism in one way or another. And to be coherent in our way of thinking about it obliges us to allow what we learn from God about the nature of social justice. It forces us to open ourselves to criticism.
And
that makes sense.
I mean, think about the abolitionists, especially, or even the anti-apartheid people in South Africa. The abolitionists started from the notion that Africans were in fact human beings. And I'll grant you, a lot of Christians,
and
made in the image of God. You know, Sojourner Truth writes her essay, "Ain't I a Woman?" Right? Am I not a human being? If I am a human being, do I not deserve to be treated like all other human beings? Was the church filled with sin over the issue of slavery and over our way that we treated African Americans? Oh yeah, I'm not trying to deny that. But the critique came from inside the faith. From inside the faith, they said, if we're all made in the image of God, which is what it says right up there in the beginning of Genesis, then there is no way that you can deny the humanity of another human being. This is the same argument that friends of ours who are very much into the theology and I don't know quite how to contextualize it, but are very concerned about both the rights and the treatment of those who are disabled in some way or another. And they work very hard from that premise. Because in fact, there's an awful lot of the world that says, if you are not going to be a productive member of society, whatever that means, then you should not have a life. At either end of life, they say that. You're just a drain on all of our resources. But our friends who are working on this issue theologically start from that premise that we're all made in the image of God and we all bear it. So it's hard for Christians to move off that. That's the anchoring pole from which Christians have to do everything when they think about what it means to be human and how human beings are going to function in the world or with each other in relationship to one another. Do we screw it up? Yeah. And I'm not making light of that. We screw it up a lot, but inherent in our very belief system is something that says, this is true. And when you deviate from it, you have deviated into error. One of the things, and we're going to start talking about God here for all of 10 minutes. One of the things that's important about Christianity, and one of the things that we'll carry through in the conversation over the next couple of weeks, is it's really important to understand that Christianity cannot be relativist. You cannot, as a Christian, say, well, what's true for you isn't true for me, and your truth is equal to my truth. The truth in Christianity is centered around God and around the nature of human beings. Or God and Jesus Christ, let's put it that way. So you can't say Well, it's okay if you don't believe that every human being has some inherent dignity and worth. As a Christian, that's a fundamental truth of our understanding of the world. And so we can't relativize our faith. We can say, I understand that your faith doesn't agree with my faith, and I respect your right to differ, but this is truth.
One of the interesting things about this discussion, or where you are right now, is with philosophical systems or theological systems, definitions become very important.
Exactly.
We start with the premise of all human lives are of equal value. What does it mean to be human? Given the advances in neonatal science and so forth, at what point are you considered human if you're not able to sustain yourself outside the womb? If you're, very premature, we've dealt with that in our family. Of course, we want all the resources brought to bear to save the life of a very premature infant. And at the same time, it may or may not be fair to question the amount of resources that go into preservation of the life of a child who may be very disabled, or at the end of life, as most of us know, 80% of our healthcare dollars are spent on our last 6 months of our lives. And I think there's a question, there are questions around not only particular justice, but distributive justice, taking the resources that are available to a society and allocating them in some way that respects the dignity of human people, while at the same time, perhaps parceling out those resources in a way that meets the needs of as many people as possible. Those are just very difficult questions, and
They are, and Kevin, I don't think we mean to trivialize them. They are very difficult questions. And then the difference, I think, is we have a tendency to take a very utilitarian notion or attitude towards this, and to think, well, what are you worth? What is a life worth? Okay, all of those questions, and fundamentally, the question we still have to come back to as Christians is a utilitarian understanding of human life isn't necessarily a divine understanding of human life. And it can lead us to make extremely truncated decisions in one way or another. Utility is not the best measure of a human life. Do we have some serious questions? Yes, about the fact that we spend so much at the end of life to preserve it, but that's a question that we can answer without being utilitarian about it. It's a question about the way that we have approached death culturally. And so it gets a lot more complicated. My concern is that when we lose that sight of sort of this true north kind of understanding of what humanity is, then all those other decisions become simply decisions that involve dollars and or your ability to work and be productive.
Yeah, I think, Kevin, you raise a really interesting point, and the thought it sparks on my part is I don't think that getting clear about what Natalie's identifying as a way of orienting ourselves as Christians necessarily makes some of those decisions any easier. I think you're right. The complexity of those questions is endemic. It's basic to the very issues themselves. But I guess what we're suggesting is that as Christians, there are certain convictions about life about justice, about being made in the image of God, that leads us into the complexities in a different way and forces us to sit with them in a different way. A really simple, I think probably, I mean, I hope it's not debatable as an example, is what happened with the virus and what's called the hospital incident command protocols that were put in place when the virus really got a hold on the country. It prioritized the utilitarian dimensions of healthcare to the exclusion of the presence of chaplains, to the exclusion of the presence of families, to the exclusion of the presence of clergy. And I don't, by any stretch of the imagination, think we should have been allowed to kind of waltz in and out of hospitals as we normally did up to the point that the virus hit. But what was really shocking, I thought, about the implicit assumptions behind hospital command protocols was the physical was the only thing that mattered. So as a priest, you couldn't contact a chaplain who could get to a patient for you. And people died alone. And in some cases, not only died alone, but were buried remotely.
Yep.
And the question is, you know, how did we manage to do that?
And there are therapists and clergy all over the country who are trying to pick up the pieces of people who have survived that kind of experience, either after having lost someone or been hospitalized alone. And it turns out that their spiritual and psychological needs were really important.
Huge.
Yeah.
And again, you know, this whole notion of the fact that one of the priorities that shapes our convictions about social justice as Christians is that it's shaped by this conviction that we're made in the image of God. If you look at that situation from that theological point of view, the complexities of deciding who can be in a hospital, under what circumstances, with what kind of PPP, how often, none of those complexities go away, but you do begin to think about it in a completely different way than if you're thinking of it from materialist and utilitarian points of view, which say it's all about the medicine and it's all about the physical. Bobby?
One thought and one topic that is in my mind from this discussion is, and it's kind of an aside, but the idea that there is an abundance of God. There's abundance in what we have from God. Now, whether or not we're appropriating it, and we're not, that's something to be considered, I think, you know, in this kind of discussion.
No, I think that's a good point, Bobby. And I hope we'll get there. I'm gonna.
I think we have to stick with this.
We'll see where we go there. But there are other questions or observations. Anything anybody else wanted to add to the conversation?
Thank
Okay.
you for that observation,
Yeah, thanks,
Kevin.
and
Really
Kevin. Yeah.
helpful. And Jack, thanks for the question.
So-
I will close by noting one of my former philosophy professors just, you know, he would always keep asking the question, why?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
It's actually also a great question to keep asking in spiritual direction and or therapy.
Yep.
It works real well there too. There's a question that's asked in Micah, and I'm hoping that everybody can answer this. What does the Lord require of you?
Walk justly, love mercy. There's three.
To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
Yeah.
One of the things that as we go through what we understand of God, both through scripture and elsewhere, that we'll find is that justice and mercy always go together. They don't get separated in the nature of God. In fact, God is, and we'll pick up here next week, God is the fullness of justice and love and mercy, of beauty and truth and righteousness and power. And all of those things are always together. None of them act without the others. It's only in human living that we want to act with those as though they're separate things. But in God, each of those things, justice, love, mercy, beauty, truth, righteousness, power, they only receive their full meaning in relationship with one another. So God's justice is going to look different from what our justice may look like. But God's justice, our justice is to model God's justice. There's a wonderful passage in Deuteronomy. I think it's Deuteronomy 16, verse 20. And it says, justice alone shall you pursue, that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. I think it's a critically important part of the instruction that God gives the people of Israel to help them form the society and to become the people that God intends for them to be. And one last thing, and we'll come back to this next week.
By the way,
Right.
I think that really, in other terms, Bobby, I think that actually refers to the kind of abundance you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Abundance takes a lot of specific forms, and I think in this case, it's the abundance of mercy that comes into play. Anyway,
Right.
Go ahead.
Good. Now I'm completely lost. Where was I going?
I'm sorry. I interrupted the train.
Yeah. I'll see if I can get that back. It was going to be a nice place to end.
It was right after that passage from Deuteronomy.
Right. But justice is, I know what I was going to say. This is worth knowing. And it's something because I don't expect most of you to have done significant study in ancient Near Eastern history. Okay. The notions of justice that you find in the Old Testament are not the notions of justice that you find in any of the other cultural documents and artifacts we have from the ancient Near East. That's true in Mesopotamia, that's true among the Assyrians, it's true among the Egyptians, it's true among the Hittites, it's true among the Greeks and the Romans. It's something we need to remember, that I think we fail to remember, because the world has been, at least our part of the world, has been so changed by fundamentally Jewish and Christian assumptions about the nature of human beings. There is no concept of justice in the rest of the ancient world that regards human beings, each human being, all human beings, as having inherent worth and dignity. And there is no concept of justice that combines mercy and or that says that we will be judged equally before the judge. You know, Deuteronomy goes on to say that God, he doesn't take bribes, he's not partial, and he executes justice for the orphan and the widow, the most defenseless. He loves strangers and he provides them with food and clothing. Okay. That's different from everyone else around them. And part of the reason, beyond knowing the history, is if somebody has to say, our God doesn't take bribes, he cares about widows and orphans and sees that they get justice, and he loves strangers and provides them food. If somebody has to say that about their God, then it means that somebody else doesn't have a God like that. So it's worth remembering that what we end up with in scripture and in our understandings of God and justice isn't like it is anywhere else in the world. And so that gives us a much different starting place. Does it solve all our problems? No, sure doesn't. But we'll get more into this next week. We'll talk more about specifically what God's justice might look like, and about how that relates to what we know about further about what we know about ourselves as human beings. So anyway, but some of us anyway have to go to church one way or the other. We have to get online or we have to be in church. We'll see whoever we see there. And blessings on your week. We will have formation next week.
In the Paul study.
In the Paul study also, but we'll be doing it from New Hampshire. So next week, we'll be gone on Sunday. Alan and Ashley will be leading morning prayer.
We're visiting.
So we're going to go see my parents. I haven't seen them in a year and they're in their upper 80s. So I think we're going to go see them. So God's blessings, everyone. Have a wonderful week.
Excellent. Excellent.
See y'all later.
Take care.